What do you need, Clive? Well, you need to leave.
Why?
Because I'm streaming, like Mommy said. Go. You gotta get going, kiddo. I know. I just want you to try and listen some of the time. All right. Hello, everyone. I see some messages in the chat already. Happy Sunday. Hey, hello, and hello from Brazil, more specifically as well. Hopefully audio is working. If you guys can give me some indication in the chat, that'd be great. But I am waiting for it to update. Hopefully that should be going here in a moment. There we go. Cool. Anyway, make sure I'm getting stuff in the chat. It's working. Cool. With that said, then I guess we're just gonna get started, covering, tons and tons of stuff as always. So we're gonna actually start here. This is the paper that I was on, or the art for it, by Pedro Salas and Sergei Krasovsky. So huge shout out to them. Really appreciate it. I didn't really go into this art in my separate video on it, so I wanted to just start there with the bit that I was published on. So yeah, here you have your very basal early Tyrannosauroid, where it's much smaller, and it's standing on top of a dead Carcharodontosaur, because the death of the Carcharodontosaurs is kind of what allowed the larger sizes to be attained by the Tyrannosauroids. And then on one side you have the Megaraptorans, large arms and such, succeeding in South America as a representation of that, and then the Tyrannosaurids, things like Tyrannosaurus rex, being more successful up in the north. So that's kind of just what the art is, since we had it as the thumbnail, but I didn't go into the details of what the art is for. So yeah, that's what the art is, and then just various representative fauna of the titanosaurs in the southern continents and the ceratopsians up in the north. Moving to the paper itself, I actually scrolled down to the bottom earlier, but yeah, there was a lot that we had brought into this paper. So first, you just have your general body size, right? Your mass, and you can see here Sinotyrannus or Newtyrannus are kind of the odd ones out for at least a lot of these early groups, which is kind of why we also did climate, because it's like, okay, well, these two are living in colder areas. Is that why the Tyrannosaurs got bigger? Because we know there's cooling after the Turonian. Is it just colder climates that are causing larger sizes? And it turns out no, not particularly. You can see here again where, yeah, these are the colder ones, but then things like Alioramus, Nanuqsaurus, and even Dilong are still living in pretty cold environments, and they're not getting big because of the cold. So yeah, really good signal that we got there, that climate wasn't directly the cause of the Megaraptorans and the Tyrannosaurs becoming really, really large. Instead, it was probably the cooling that did kill off the Carcharodontosaurs, and then it was just the absence of the Carcharodontosaurs that allowed them to get so much larger. And then yeah, your migration pattern of the Megaraptorans through Europe into Africa, and then across into the various other southern continents. And you can actually really see that here, where a lot of these are really starting in Asia, especially these early ones in the early Cretaceous. Although I do know there is some other stuff that is floating about that not necessarily will complicate this. It'll complement it once that gets published. Loving the contrast between them. They're great animals. I just I closed the figure, but yeah, the contrast between Tyrannosaurids just having big head and little arms, and the Megaraptorans having big arms but kind of a little head is fantastic, despite being seemingly closely related. And I know there's a few groups that are working on trying to resolve that phylogeny a bit better as well. Get the next one loaded. There we go. Oh, why are you saying I need to reload? All right, there we go. All right, so also real quick on the previous paper, thanks for Cass and Charlie and everyone for bringing me into that. I do want to shout them out. They're all wonderful people. It was fantastic to be a part of that project. Regardless, now we're looking at an ecdysozoan fossil embryo from the lower Cambrian in China. And so ecdysozoans are things like arthropods is going to be the easiest thing. Insects, where they shed their exoskeleton and grow a new one. That is ecdysozoa. Nematodes go through this. There's other kinds of worms that go through this as well. This one is a new one, and it's this. So this is Sacus gigiensis, and it doesn't look like a lot, but this is kind of what we get as some of these like weird blobby things that are related to ecdysozoans. So they would have had not necessarily an exoskeleton, but they would have shed their outer skin and then developed more of a new one, grown a new one. How late are you? You are not very late at all. In fact, I will say, like, I talked about the paper that I was on so far, and this is the second paper, so you are just about on time. So no worries, no worries. I'm getting into it. There's other things like that are related to this, that reconstruction of it. Sorry for the jump scare that this is going to be, but Saccharitis, where it's this really weird blobby thing. Yeah, so there are these weird Cambrian things that are just kind of seemingly related to all of the nematodes and preapulids and chinorrheic worms, and then arthropods as well. Just really, really strange animals. And I have a note in here to go to the supplementary material. No video. Oh, come on. Are you not letting me download it now? Okay. There we go. Where they have the micro CT scans, and you can really kind of see, like, there are very distinct patterns in how some of it is built. But these are basically also, I say this, but they're also basically just embryos. They're basically plankton that are just floating in the ocean. So they don't really have a stomach or anything at this point, probably. They just kind of hang out. So, again, early evolution, Cambrian evolution is weird. Okay, so there's that one. Next one is talking about xenodens, and more specifically how xenodens is probably not valid. Where is the actual, because it's anatomical record, right? I don't remember if I have the full access to it, or it's open access. There we go. Cool. This is xenodens. It's this weird mosasaur that was described where it had these much closer packed in teeth that were also a lot more serrated. You can kind of see where the serrations, they're flatter, they're more angular. So it's a really, really weird animal. This paper is basically going, yeah, it's not real. It's a forgery, which we do know some of the fossils coming from Morocco can be, because the people who are digging them up are in one of the poorest regions of the world. And so it's like, yeah, they're going to do that so they can try and have money to eat. That's not really, it's not their fault that the region's poor. So like, yeah, no, it makes sense that that's going to happen on occasion. But what they're suggesting is these teeth are two of them that were emplaced into essentially a single alveoli, a single tooth socket. So that's what Henry Sharp is arguing here. And they look at a number of different mosasaurs, lizards, modern lizards and such, to really show kind of how the spacing of these work. And so what they're saying is potentially what happened is they might have, kind of have these little glue pedestals that are helping to hold the tooth in, and that's why the teeth are, kind of projected out of the socket more so even. So yeah, and they suggest, hey, the easiest way to fix this is to just X-ray the whole specimen, get it CT scanned, because the differences in density between hypothetical glue, plaster, whatever, and actual bone will become very, very rapidly apparent. And so reportedly, the person who is in charge of the specimen, Nick Longrich, is planning on doing that. But yeah, it's they also present a few issues where, yeah, some of these specimens coming out of Morocco are named from just teeth or are otherwise not shown to have good provenance, so we can't really say anything very specific about their taxonomy. So maybe this kind of really high endemism of, we know so many really unique mosasaurs from just Morocco, might just be because the fossils are weird and people are naming things a little bit too aggressively. Which, it happens in the sciences, but double checking everything with things like this is part of what helps to fix that. All right. And now we have the youngest fossil occurrence of ichthyosaurs in the southern hemisphere. So the ichthyosaurs are the dolphin-like marine reptiles. So, or dolphin-like marine reptiles. So, they were global. They were everywhere. This is essentially where they are in the late Cenomanian, which is about the Middle Cretaceous. We get them from Europe a lot. Europe's this big archipelago. It's great for finding stuff. And then you jump down, and now we have one from the southern continents, which is nice. It's suggesting that, yeah, they went extinct globally pretty much all at once, as opposed to going extinct in the southern hemisphere and then going extinct in the northern hemisphere. So it's just helping to kind of clarify some of what's happening. And you have some of these various paddles here where they do weird things with their fingers and their in their flippers, just as far as the densities of bones that are getting packed in. Sorry, I saw a comment. Does paleontology use the same convention of adding Candidatus to possible non-confirmed proposed? That I don't think is a thing that happens. I think it's much more of a naming it, or you just leave it as indeterminate, and let it get named later. Because in paleontology, every single named animal is technically a hypothesis. We have a hypothesis that Tyrannosaurus rex used to exist. We have a lot of really good fossils, so that's a very strong hypothesis. But technically, it's still a hypothesis because we can't go out there and find it living and show that, yes, this is what it is, and this is the perfect specimen of it to show that. So no, as far as that comparison to microbiology. Oh yeah, and then here's the geology of it, so you can see where they have this really big section of rock where they could really measure everything and get it dated very well. I'm trying to remember which one. Yeah, okay. So on the subject of some of the various nematodes and such, they also have the Scalidophoran, which is one of these worm lineages that's actually really closely related to the nematodes and such. And so there's some fossil ones here, and it looks like this one actually has some of the nervous system preserved. I have figure 2D marked as, when you zoom in, hopefully I can zoom in. Nope. Oh, it's not going to let me zoom in like that. Oh, I knew there was something for zooming in. Oh, and then it took me straight back out. That's unfortunate. Zoom in. There we go. You can kind of see where this little ridge is. That's essentially the preserved nervous system. And what's interesting about these versus a lot of other arthropods is other ecdysozoans is some of them will essentially have paired nervous cords where they're running parallel to each other along the whole body, and so one controls the whole left, one controls the whole right. What's happening here is it's showing, hey, really early in the nematodes plus the Scalidophoran, they developed just a singular nervous cord, so it just came straight down and in. It also says figure. I mean, this is the process of it essentially, where you can see where essentially the animal died, the skin got pinched up, created the little ridge there, and then in certain situations, that little ridge could be preserved for the nervous cord. And there you go. Here's the tree. You can see like here in some of these counterranks and such, they have these paired nervous system bits. Here's Panarthropoda. So this is using a velvet worm, but they're closely related to the rest of arthropods. Again, paired, and there's some links, but it's paired. So this is kind of where the preapulids and whatnot did this really interesting, just singular nervous system, nervous cord. Jumping ahead a few months, that I am going to talk about. I have a lot of papers that I'm talking about because I'm trying to catch all the way up so that I can justify doing shorter videos again. So on some of the bigger stuff that comes out. So I will get to the Troodon bit. That is going to be further down. Saccharitis, we already talked about. It's, you know, that really weird kind of floating blob thing. This floating blob thing. This is just saying, hey, it's a larva. Specifically of one of these worms, these Scalidophoran worms that are kind of related to nematodes and such. Probably didn't have like any real stomach or anything. Still Cambrian. This is seemingly just kind of how they did their reproduction as far as sending larvae out into the ocean. That looked very, very strange. All right, and then we have a paper on Argentavis magnificens, which is like this massive, massive condor type animal. So I actually have a friend who studies bird brain, so I asked them a little bit about this. And they were saying it's hard to make really, really hard assumptions like this paper kind of does. However, the paper does suggest that based on the shapes in the brains, it would have been more reliant on vision versus smell. So when you're thinking of a turkey vulture, that's going to rely a lot more on smell. Other vultures do use sight a lot more, and you can see kind of the different portions of the brain. It lines up really well with vulture gryphus, the griffin vulture, which is common in some parts of southern Europe and parts of Africa. Versus here's going to be your Cathartes. This is going to be more of your turkey vulture kind of vulture. And then you have like, you know, your owls and stuff where there's other animals knocking about. But they suggest that, you know, it was big. It may have not just been scavenging, but also just stealing food because it was that large of an animal. And again, just a lot of micro CT scans of the brain cases and whatnot. What did I say? Here, and yeah, you can see like it's well within what we kind of expect for most birds, right? It's not like it's some huge outlier despite being a much larger bird. So yeah, it seems like it was definitely doing the condor thing, but also maybe doing a little bit more kleptoparasitism, where it's a parasite in that it's stealing food from other birds. So yeah, there you go. It's much closer to these kind of scavengers for the size of the brain. Yeah, it is what we expected, but with just a little bit more. Okay, and this is a big look at the Wheeldon, and more specifically the Wadhurst Clay. They looked at a bunch of different teeth here. You can see it's kind of here in the southern portion, southeastern portion of the UK. And as we scroll, they have a whole thing on the various teeth that have been found there. And so there's at least one Piatnitsky-saurid, which is this weird group that has some... There's a lot of taxonomy that's happening with that group right now. But vaguely megalosaur-ish. Allosaur-ish. Piatnitsky-saurus also has these epicobasal ridges in some of these, which is something that we see in a lot of animals that are actually feeding more around the water. And we do think that with at least some megalosaurs, they may have been doing that, especially the Spinosaurids, obviously, which are at least closely related. So potentially this whole group with the Piatnitskysaurids, the megalosaurs and such, was just spending a lot more time near the water. There's also a really early Tyrannosauroid, something closely related to the Dromaeosaurs. So it's all, again, kind of what we expect, but finding something like a Piatnitskyssaurid also living there is really interesting. So yeah, it's nice to find some of this. And here we go. Here's your figure where you have these kind of Piatnitskysaurus type teeth, your more Spinosaur like teeth, basal Tyrannosaur teeth, and then your Dromaeosaurian teeth. Which means by this point in the early Cretaceous, all of these groups had to have evolved, and all of these groups in between also must have evolved. They just may not have been present in the UK, just because it was the European archipelago. It's hard to try and get across islands. It happens inevitably, but not necessarily quickly. And then they have a couple analyses on the shapes of the teeth and such. So yeah, that's what's happening there. Even in places with very poor fossil preservation, you can find some really neat stuff. Okay, and so this is actually the earliest monofenestratan pterosaur, which means essentially the fenestra in front of the eyes, the hole in the skull in front of the eyes, is really big in these ones. And this is the oldest one, and it's coming from Argentina, which isn't necessarily a great place for finding pterosaurs. Pterosaurs are very fragmentary, which means our best glimpses at what's happening with them is from things like the Solnhofen limestone, where it's just such a great preservational environment that we get really good glimpses into their biology. And as I scroll down and find the fossil here, you are going to see kind of what I mean, because it's like, look, it's a pterosaur. Can't you tell? There's a few little limb bones and such that are nice for that, as well as some parts of the skull with the maxilla and whatnot, and some of the where the teeth would have gone. But yeah, it's been named Melcampter patico. It's a partial skull, like I said. There's 2 teeth, a couple vertebrates, and this is going to be one of the finger bones, but it's not the finger bone that would have supported the wing. And so you can see kind of here with the reconstruction based on others that are more complete, this really big fenestra that I was talking about. And I say go to which one? Figure 10. There you go. And you can see kind of some of these various ones. So here's the current one that they studied. And then here's some of these other early ones. And you can kind of see where, yeah, now it's starting to make sense why they actually were able to name this and say, okay, it's the oldest one of these. But yeah, it's just good to start finding some more of these. And there is good diversity in South America. It's, again, just the matter of finding them, which is hard because partial animals. I remember there's an article in Nature Briefings a week or months back. Months back on researchers who did comparative and anatomical studies of avian and mammalian brains and get some insight into their brain evolution. I'm sure there was. Brains I do not keep up with as well as I could. Brain cases are just not, neurology is not quite my thing right now. In the future, maybe, but not at this exact moment. So I don't think I have that one, unfortunately, added in here. Spatiotemporal distribution of Mesozoic dinosaur diversity. Basically, where are dinosaurs diverse and where are they not? Figure 1. Hey, look, here's where we find them from. Right? I mean, this is pretty straightforward. There we go. Zoom. We have, like, this really strong number of taxa coming from, the western United States where the mountains are, large parts of Europe, parts of China, and then Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, the various former Soviet republics. And then, a handful in Australia, parts of North Africa, parts of South America, and then just this huge parts of the world that are just massive gaps. Just because in part, funding for research is hard to get, especially if you're in some of these poorer regions where it's more important to do other things. Um, but then also just because the rocks may not be the right age elsewhere. Um, anyway, so yeah, this is just talking about where they are, where they're the most diverse, and you can kind of see how when they're zooming in on different locations, it's like, okay, well, if you're here in the western interior seaway, you're probably not going to get many dinosaurs because most dinosaurs can't swim in the middle of the ocean very well. However, you start getting closer to shore, yeah, you can find stuff here. I actually was basically in this area just a week or two ago looking for fossils right in this area in New Mexico. And then if you go way upland, you're not going to find stuff because if you go in the mountains, those mountains aren't there anymore. They've eroded, and that means those bones also got transported long distances and have mostly fallen apart, if not totally fallen apart. So, yeah. No worry about being late. We started at 10 o'clock, so you missed maybe the first 20 minutes or so. So, not too bad. And the first part of that was me talking about the paper that I have a video on that I was one of the authors on. So, not a big concern. Anyway, so yeah, you have your taphonomic filters where there's certain body sizes that are more likely to be preserved. So there's your potential, completeness, being able to actually identify it, and then you can bring it into a phylogeny. Yeah, there's a lot going on. However, it does seem. Is there a figure there? Nope, there's not. There's just the figure here. Latitudinally, though, yeah, it does seem like there is differences in diversity across the various latitudes, which again could be a bias just from collections. It could be a bias to maybe they just were more common in the northern hemisphere. There's also less land in the southern hemisphere right now, so it's hard to know for sure. So yeah, I would expect based on the South American record and even the African record, because got to remember Africa was further south at that time. We should expect to see a lot more stuff still in the southern hemisphere regardless. Waiting for scientist name of large Mosasaur, Thalassosthanatos. I tell you what, some of the names of things can be pretty intense. As long as it's a moderately complete one, I'm okay with it. As a name. That's my biggest thing, is naming things that are actually like useful. Okay, and this is Noasaurus, which is a somewhat small theropod related to Mesozoic Velocisaurus. Mesozoic is going to be the one that most people I think are going to recognize, as it has the teeth that are procumbent and starting to point out, so it can snag smaller prey. I thought I had this one. Regardless, some of the Noasaurs were more herbivorous, some were more carnivorous. Based on what they did here, Noasaurus itself was probably more predatory. It would have been an opportunist, kind of like Mesozoic. So we're getting better data on some of these Noasaurs that are, again, just really strange and interesting animals. Oh, hang on one moment. Let's get... Yeah, this one's a PDF. Hang on. I think it was someone's thesis, to be honest. Downloads. Open with... Or a chapter from their thesis, rather. So, it's a Spanish journal. And so this is just doing finite element analysis of Ceratosaurus and Allosaurus to kind of see how they might have been feeding differently from one another. And so, yeah, based on the FEA, they were getting different values of pressures and whatnot. So they were almost certainly eating different things. They don't really go into great detail about how they could have been predating differently upon different things. Or what they might have been feeding on. However, I know there is work that is being worked on that is trying to maybe separate out some of the niche partitioning that was happening in the Morrison Formation. So, yeah. So it's nice to get some of this going and see more work being done specifically to compare diets of large theropods that would have been living alongside one another. And they should also be a thesis, which I'm just gonna go straight to here. There's not really figures for this one because it is a full thesis that I'd have to download, but I saw this talk at the Society of Urban Paleontology meeting in Minneapolis, and it actually won the Romer Prize for being like great work by someone who is still a student. They're doing their thesis. I believe it's a PhD thesis. But there's Hall's Cave in Texas where there's a good record of more recent herpetofauna, meaning amphibians and lizards and such, that essentially fell into the cave over the last few thousand years. And so what he did is he looked at all of these different organisms, kind of plotted them where they were in the cave to try to look at how the reptile fauna and amphibian faunas have changed through time, so that we can start making better associations for conservation today, which is just really fantastic. I think being able to do that kind of work and, like, applying it to the modern day is always one of those things that paleontologists get harassed a bit about, and this is one where it's very easy to see that kind of connection. And then we have one that I know some people are probably going to find controversial. Yay, controversy again. And that is snacks. It's Saurophaganax. I actually talked with Andy at SVP about his presentation there, and then the paper coming up. So it was good to good to see this come out. But it's an interesting animal. The thing is, Saurophaganax isn't valid, though, because the bones belong to various other organisms. As I recall, actually, the top part is the main part that's talking about the bones. It's been a minute since I wrote this section, and then I was getting it together. But oh, there you go. There's one of these where it's okay, cool. So here's Allosaurus. Here's Saurophaganax, here's Camarasaurus. It's just a Camarasaur for this bone, right? And you could definitely try and argue, oh, well, just use all the new stuff as a neotype or whatever. The problem is, at the end of the day, even the new stuff is still just Allosaurus. Saurophaganax becoming the Dakota Raptor of the Morrison shocked me. Dakota Raptor still is probably valid because it seems like some of the bones are still, attributable to a large dromaeosaur. There are some issues with that paper, though, and so people need to actually get in and see the Dakota Raptor material. That's the issue. Yeah, my wife's saying that the guy had to kill off his favorite dinosaur. Yeah, Andy was very excited about studying Saurophaganax because he's like, this is my favorite dinosaur. It's always been my favorite dinosaur. And then it's like, hey, by the way, it's not real. He was talking about going in to study it and get some of it imaged and such. And he was sitting there looking at it going, this isn't Theropod. And had to tell his advisor, this isn't Theropod. So, yeah. But I do appreciate that, it's a new species of Allosaurus. They could get large, which makes sense because closely related to the Carcharodontosaurs. Why is Allosaurus, that 10% smaller or whatever it is than the Carcharodontosaurs? Well, it's just those species are. Allosaurus anax is more comparable to those larger ones. Yeah, the not canon arguments are always fun to try and argue with people. Not really. Not actually that much fun. This is looking at the tails of, I believe, mostly Rhamphorhynchus, which is nice because there's a lot of them. But essentially looking at the tail veins to see how they would have helped with flying. There's a cross. The structures actually have some of these different fibers running vertically versus horizontally, depending on the way you're looking at it. But that helps to suggest it was very rigid. Essentially, as those fibers are intermeshing, they're going to make the tail vein very, very stiff. There's probably needing to be a little bit more work done on this as far as looking at the younger ones and seeing kind of how the younger ones might have been able to use this differently. Just, is there a change in this? And also, again, if you're using Rhamphorhynchus, that's great because there's a lot of them from the Solnhofen limestone I mentioned earlier. But it's not as useful if you can't do anything with them, right? Or it's not as useful if you only have one animal that you're looking at, essentially. You need to be able to get more of it. And yeah, it's just Rhamphorhynchus, which there's a few species of, but yeah, very, very basic, quick, hey, look at this note. Rhamphorhynchids had these tails that were kind of vertical to help aid in flight and positioning and such. Which, once you get down to the pterodactyloids, they totally lose that. And the monofenestrans are in there somewhere. I think they're technically right here at this node. And then pterodactyloids are further down. Yeah. So it's just what you get. It's unfortunate, like I said, that we want to look at more than just Rhamphorhynchus, but that's the one you're going to be able to see the best because there's the most specimens of it. You can actually do statistically interesting things with that. On the subject of Rhamphorhynchids, again, it's one of the best known ones. Look at that very first sentence. Over 100 specimens. The thing is, this is a big one. So you can see here some of the scale bar, but this is one that's just, kind of thrown out a little bit more. It's not one of the super, super pretty ones, but it does suggest that they could get larger. There should be a figure of, well, there's the skull, and you can see some of the parts that were damaged during prep. There's some verts. There should be, here we go. Kind of, here's your skulls of it, where you have the very young ones, and then you can see actually the supratemporal fenestra here, where it would have helped power the jaws. You can see it kind of start migrating towards the top, probably as they were going after different prey. Something maybe a little more hard-bodied, where they need that. As opposed to like very small fish and squid, just larger fish and squid, maybe belemnites, which do have more hard parts. Yeah. Okay, on the Dakotaraptor point in the comments, there are fragmentary Dakotaraptor-sized remains in the Hell Creek that were known for decades. Yeah, it's like there is evidence of a large Dromaeosaur in the Hell Creek formation. If it's Dakotaraptor or something different, remains to be seen, and that means people need to see the Dakotaraptor specimen, and no one but De Palma is allowed to see it, seemingly, because it's in his museum, and he's just like, yeah, no, I'm gonna hold on to this myself. And there you can see the various specimens we have. So we have a great growth series for Rhamphorhynchus as well, just because you can kind of track it all the way up. And yeah, again, you can see that this new one is a good bit larger, and it does show that, yeah, they could get large. It's not just the Cretaceous pterosaurs that got really big. Okay, and this is a new dinosaur from the Popogi formation, because apparently that is how you say that. It's not Popo-agi, it's Popogi. So yeah, Popogi formation. This is in Wyoming. What you need to understand is during the Triassic, when this thing would have lived, the west coast of the U.S. was having a big mountain building event. Essentially, the ancestral Rockies were getting built up. And so as that built up, what happens is, as the mountains come up, the rest of the basin behind it, the crust flexes and makes a huge basin. So that basically would have been from parts of northern Mexico all the way up into Wyoming and parts of Canada, would have been a single large basin. Not necessarily all the same river going through it, right? But various streams going through it. So we do have differences in the fauna sometimes. But what's interesting about this one, Avitum Banduivici, There should be a pronunciation guide. Because I believe this is from the Control F, systematic. There we go. Avatum. There we go. Avatum, and it is Shoshone. Anyway, this is interesting, and it's not necessarily super complete. But it's interesting because this is like the oldest dinosaur in North America, and this would have been North America at the time would have been around the equator, but what that means is, okay, maybe they weren't only in South America during the middle and late Triassic, because that's where we get a lot of the earliest dinosaurs, is South America, but maybe they were getting up here earlier than we thought, which means maybe they evolved down here earlier than we thought, or maybe they evolved somewhere else where we just don't have as good of sampling. Why is De Palma not allowing anyone to see the supposed Dakota raptor remains? That is a fantastic question. If I had an answer, I would love to give it to you, but I do not know. Anyway, where's the fossil itself? The fossils, once I get there, you'll see are not super complete, right? So you have an astragalus, which is part of the ankle, great for identifying early dinosaurs. You also have part of the femur, part of the hips, essentially, great for identifying early dinosaurs. These are the kind of parts that you'd want to find to be able to say if it's a dinosaur or not. But again, you just need to it's frustrating that it's so partial. I really wish we had more of it. I love these Triassic things. Also, when you're thinking about this, further south is things like the Moenkopi Formation, which is a little bit older than this, so there's not dinosaurs in there that we know of. There's a ton of footprints, none of which seem to be matching dinosaur footprints. So it's hard to know why essentially this thing shows up in the Popogi Formation, and we're getting nothing in Arizona up until, as far as dinosaurs, up until you get into the Petrified Forest Chilling Formation. And even then, depending on where you are, still very rare. So whatever was happening as far as the partitioning of these animals is needs to be answered, or it would be nice if it was answered. Let me say it that way. So the Aculopharans are the chitons. I can actually just do this because most people don't know about these. They're mollusks that are kind of snail-like, except they have these multiple instead of having just one shell, they have multiple little ridges that form the shell. And they're flat. They just kind of hang around. These ones are fun, though, because these ones were found with one having kind of a mohawk of various... the word is lost on me. Anyway, the various hairs that you see here. And so this one is named Punk because it has a mohawk, like, you know, the punk scene with music and all that. And if I scroll down, you have this one where it's kind of drooping over, and that one's named Emo. Same thought process. There's some question as to whether this one is maybe just a more degraded version of the other, where, you know, the various spines and such just kind of started to flop down because the animal is decayed more. So yeah, these are interesting. They show that there's a lot of weird stuff happening early in the tree in mollusks, which there's the ham, the hypothetical ancestral mollusk, which is basically, it's a shell with a body underneath it, and then all the other mollusks came from that. This is kind of a, yeah, that's definitely possibly something that was happening. But also there's a lot of variation in these groups, so it's hard to know for sure still. Is essentially what this is talking about. Scrappy Taxa in the comments. Yeah, Labocania in particular is definitely an interesting one. I know there's a lot of interesting Tyrannosaur stuff upcoming, so I will not get too much into that, but because it's not published yet. It was presented at some conferences, but other than that, it hasn't been published, like I was saying. This one's really interesting. I can actually just use the graphical abstract. So morphology is what drives evolution, right? Like genes matter, but it's how genes affect the morphology of the organism that make it matter. And this is looking at saber teeth. How do saber teeth develop? Basically, you have these positions where having saber teeth are optimal, and then you have these kind of in-between positions where it is suboptimal for being able to puncture prey versus having straighter teeth, like you would have down here with like modern big cats where they just puncture and hold, right? What it turns out is, well, once you start getting a little bit saber teeth, it's not that optimal, which means the evolutionary pressure is going to essentially just push the teeth one way or the other very rapidly. So if you have slightly longer teeth and you're able to, and that's just working for the population, it's going to very quickly get fixed to longer and longer teeth. Am I making my way towards sloths? Oh, I don't actually remember if I added that sloth paper. Ooh. So I was getting this written just a few days ago. I don't remember if I added that one or not. I feel like I might have. Regardless, yeah, I'll pull it up from the Discord because I do remember which paper it is and what it's saying. We have upcoming Tyrannosaur stuff. There's ontogeny stuff with Tyrannosaurs. Carnotaurus being short-legged, so you don't have most of it. That is... I am not worried about Carnotaurus until we find more of it. That is my current thought process. The Abelisaurs are weird. Anyway, yeah, so like I was saying, just you get this into this kind of awkward space where you're not super optimal, but then because of that, it drives it towards being on one of these two optimal ends very rapidly. So, yep. And then there's the authors and such. Oh, Rayfield's on this. That makes sense. She does a lot of the biomechanics stuff. Okay, another Tyrannosaur thing. And so this is the argument that Daspletosaurus evolved directly into Tyrannosaurus rex. And what Charlie did, he's actually one of the co-authors on the paper that I was on, is looked at essentially every single specimen and coded each of those in a phylogenetic matrix. And what you get is, you do get the Daspletosaurs potentially being more anagenetic. However, you do get this kind of separation away from everything else with Zhucheng tyrannus, where Zhucheng tyrannus and the other Tyrannosaurs, Tyrannosaurines rather, would have evolved likely in Asia, like our paper says, and then moved back across into North America. Yes, we are getting into January. I'm going all the way up till basically today. I am going to be doing covering a ton of things. So, I got a haircut. No, my hair's just wet because I got out of the shower and combed it more. Yeah, no, this is a really interesting paper. I know at least one person here in the chat has some very strong opinions about the possibility of anagenesis. But at least within a single taxa, the thing is, anagenesis is really hard to prove, and that's the idea of one animal evolving, or one species evolving directly into another. The issue is that is really hard to show in the fossil record. But it inevitably had to have happened at some point with some organisms. Essentially, they would change enough that, yeah, they'd be different enough from their ancestors to be distinct, at least morphologically. The question is, again, with just rare fossils here and there, how do you show, yeah, this species directly evolved into that one as opposed to another population of them doing that or something? But yeah, I think this is a really interesting one. It does a very good job of addressing a lot of the Daspletosaurus wilsoni concerns. Yeah. Anagenesis can also just be shown to be wrong with if a different fossil is found, right? Like as I was saying earlier, every species in paleontology is a hypothesis. We have a hypothesis that Tyrannosaurus rex existed. We just also have very good fossils of it, so it's a very strong hypothesis. Every single one of these trees is a hypothesis. It doesn't mean it's a hard, strong fact. New things can change it. And the person who has strong feelings about anagenesis is not commenting in the chat. Shame. So this is re-looking at the Bahariya formation in Egypt and the Carcharodontosaur that came from there. We now have a new name for it, which I forget off the top of my head, but it should be there. And a lot of this is looking at some of this older stuff. Tammiraptor Mark Graphi. So yeah, this is the new name for the initial Carcharodontosaurus, some of the initial Carcharodontosaurus material, which largely got blown up during World War II. However, essentially, hey, look, it would have had this weird little crest there, and it's very Carcharodontosaur. There's not a ton of it, but you at least have some of the hips, some of the maxilla and whatnot, which is good for identifying these different theropod groups. So yeah, there it is, and they have some nice art for it down here at the bottom as well, I believe. I will get there. Gosh, this is such a long paper. Come on, show me your fancy art. There we go. There we go. There's the nice fancy art of it. I do like it with the lighting like this because it makes it feel like it's like on safari and you found the animal and took a photo of it with flash. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the other thing in addition to the photos of the fossils is Stromer had wonderful ability to sketch the fossils in detail. So I really enjoy that for it. Your paper came out the same day. I do not know if I have that paper in here now. If this is the sloth one, I'm not sure if I do. So if you put it in the papers part of the Discord, I will pop and open at the end and do a quick look through. Sorry, we've very clearly been busy, which is why I'm trying to catch up on 6 months of months in review. So, oh, someone's saying the definitive Carcharodontosaurus remains we have are really crappy and fragmentary, on par with Spinosaurus, whatever Spino is. Spinosaurus doesn't exist. You cannot show me the holotype. This one actually, I believe, is, yeah, looking at cursorial ecomorphology and essentially when the animals lived during the Cretaceous. And this is really important because there's the arctometatarsus, which, if we, oh, really, the smallest version of the photo. If I go to download figure, it's not going to work the way I want it to. Whatever, I'm just going to, yeah, well, a little less there. Arctometatarsus. So this is what you have kind of in these Tyrannosaurids, Ornithomimosaurs, Alvarezsaurs, Oviraptorans, and the Troodontids. This, where it gets pinched real tightly in between, digit 3 on the foot, helps to stabilize the entire foot. So what that means is essentially, since it's the whole thing being stabilized, it's really good for efficient movement. I actually also know someone who's working more on this as well, but this is just showing it evolved multiple times. And I think there's going to be some biomecanicists who are going to enjoy this paper. That's figure 1, figure 2. There you go, you can see it here as well, where there's these different groups that have it, and kind of when they develop it with the more red kind of or where they mark it on the graph. Apologies. And then figure 3, kind of this is the timing for when this occurs. And so it's really interesting this doesn't show up really until at least the early Cretaceous in some of these Troodontids and the Oviraptorans, and then later even in the Tyrannosaurs. Slorosaurs were kind of like the athletes of theropod dinosaurs. In some respects, the thing is, because of Tyrannosaurus rex, there's a lot more work that's been done on the athleticism, essentially, of the Slorosaurs versus other theropod groups. And that's especially true with some of the more rare theropod groups like the Abelisaurs. I'd be particularly interested in because I just think they're nuts. They're just fun, weird animals. But regardless, yeah, you can see like kind of where some of these things start to develop the various arctometatarsal's in order to propel themselves further and faster and more efficiently throughout their environments. So that's what this paper is all about. I'm just going to say in the chat, don't let any of the comments, don't take comments personally. We don't need to get too upset. Yeah. And this one I was looking at, there we go. Figure 1, this is looking at various growth strategies in various dinosaurs, and it's kind of showing what we have where. So the circles are going to be kind of the bone histology, where you can cut it open and you look at your growth rings and such. Just good fossil evidence of juveniles, essentially, is what the other bones are, right? Because a lot of these groups you only get the adults from. And then nest building, that kind of, if you have embryos and such. So it's really just an overall review of growth of dinosaurs. So yeah, it's just what do we know about it? And the thing is, we know some, not as much as we'd like to, but some. And as for another review, this is just all about dinosaur locomotion. You have your musculoskeletal models where you're putting the muscles based on the skeleton. You're also looking at your bones to see how much they would be able to support and whatnot. Comparing it to modern animals, looking at tracks. There's a lot of stuff that you can kind of do here. They do suggest that we can get some better models for some of these muscles and tendons and such in order to really start nailing down some of the motion better. And as you can see, it's not really figures here, it's just that first one, because it's like, okay, this is how we've done this, and then, you know, better modeling and such would probably be good for being able to understand their movement better, especially when you're thinking about a lot of the theropod dinosaurs and some of the ornithopods that are bipedal, because we don't really have large-bodied bipedal animals anymore, other than, you know, a few of the radites like the ostriches and such. Even ourselves, as being bipedal and relatively large animals, we're larger than the vast majority of animals. But yeah, it's just an interesting thing where most animals today are quadrupedal, and we're trying to study things that moved in a fundamentally different way a lot of the time. There we go. And this is looking at the adult humerus of, why am I not able to see this? The adult humerus of Megaraptor. I thought I had figures for that. Just go here and go to images. So yeah, I mean, it's just looking at the bones. You can see that the muscles that are on the adult one are basically the same as what we see in the juvenile. The juvenile specimen is much more complete, so we actually have the humerus, the upper arm bone. So we really need some other age groups to add in. But again, like I said, it's similar to what we see in the juveniles. So there's not really a ton a ton that's that we can comment on, right? Like I said, it's similar. It shows that they were pretty conservative as far as their body plan, just scale change seemingly, and they were still doing a lot of the same things with their arms, which seemingly the Megaraptorans, more than the Tyrannosaurs, were using their arms for hunting more so. Sciagna. So this is looking at more of the morphology of it, which is maybe an early Rhamphorhynchid, which there's another paper down here that changes some of the trees for pterosaurs. But yeah, so here's your fossil. It's actually reasonably decent for a non-Lagerstätten pterosaur. But yeah, it's in 3D. It did still have these really big claws, so there's a suggestion that it may have actually been scansorial, meaning it would have been climbing around in trees a lot more. And for the Middle Jurassic, it is pretty big for a pterosaur. The humerus is also a little bit funny. See if I can zoom in. The humerus is just a little bit funny because you have a larger, or not a larger, the delta pectoral crest, which would have attached to the chest muscles, is just a little bit more towards the middle of the body. Rather than it being more on the side of the bone, which means it was doing something different than later pterosaurs, and we don't really understand why. And then your neck vertebra are more like those that we find in the pterodactyloids, which all had long necks, but this one is not a super, super long neck. So again, you're starting to see kind of this mosaic of traits that we see between the early pterosaurs and the later pterosaurs. And then, you got your CT scans of the skull and such. So yeah, it's a weird pterosaur for what we would have expected, as far as still having these big claws for climbing trees, being found in a more marine environment. So I mean, maybe they were just still using the trees very widely at this stage in the Middle Jurassic. It's hard to know. Batomorphia is the rays, stingrays, manta rays, those kinds of things. But essentially it's looking at Solnhofen fossils, because again, Solnhofen is great for finding some of these. And it's so going, yeah, we have some of these modern forms coming in, but also some of these extinct forms. So I mean, it's very similar to the modern ones, but it is an extinct group, which is Apolithobatiformes, formies. So yeah, there's various looks at the various fossils of these. These are cartilaginous fish, so they do not fossilize as nicely. There's a phylogeny somewhere. There we go. So yeah, you can kind of see this is when we start getting these first rays, and then you start getting into some of these groups that are still around today. Just the only question is, okay, well, how much could these actually be nested in here? And then where are the fossils of these ones, which are going to be hard to find. So on the subject of actually going back a few subjects, Piatnitskysaurus. Oh, I will get to the sloth paper right after this one. Piatnitskysaurus is from South America, the Cañadón Asfalto Formation. And this is a paper that is looking at the leg mechanics. The legs are more like those of really early theropods, as opposed to having the kind of structures that you'd expect in other large theropods. So that could potentially be something about why they weren't quite as common. Maybe they were only doing this very well in very specific environments. But yeah, it's just more of the leg stuff on Piatnitskysaurus. So the hip morphology back here is going to be much more conservative and not as derived as some of the other theropods. Okay. And I think you added me. Yeah, because I got a notification. Is that... This ought to be this one, I think, right? Inside integument. Oh, yeah. I do remember this one vaguely, actually. I just didn't pause to look through the whole thing when I was going back through all my sources. But yeah, I mean, sloths are big. They're going to have their own thermoregulation issues. And some of them had osteoderms where there's, bones inside the skin. So you're going to run into issues with that as well, essentially, is part of the problem, right? You're gonna be you're gonna those are gonna influence how the skin is able to give away and absorb temperature, heat. Also, they sampled the teeth. Sorry, I am looking through this paper for basically the first time. Like I said, I skimmed it once. I'm trying to just remember, and that was back like when it came out in February. So, but I am not much of a mammal guy, so I'm just trying to process some of this. You have your various different temperatures, which I assume was gotten from stable isotopes in the teeth, which makes sense. That'd be a really good way to do that. The lead author is in the chat, so can confirm if I am correct. But yeah, so you have your various different sloths here that you can see. There you have slightly different body temperatures as they were getting sampled. Also, relatively lower heat since there's Xenarthrans. Xenarthrans is this weird group of mammals that mostly developed in Africa and South America, from what I recall. And it includes things like the sloths and the anteaters and whatnot. But you can see they have lower metabolic rates. And so your typical placentals are most other mammals. And you can see where they have the higher metabolic rates. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if he can comment on that. Yeah, and here it is down here too. Let's see this. Clumped isotopes, actually. And those were body temps, yeah. Yeah, I started getting there. Anyway, and then you have like your modern ones where it's very low as far as the amount of energy they give off. And then you have your other large animals and what they're comparable to. So some of them are more comparable to bears with Nothrotheriops, Mylodon, and whatnot. And so you're actually getting rates that are so much lower. Oh yeah, no. So this is the similar size. There we go. This is the amount of energy they're expending per day. That's what it is. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting through this all at once. Okay, South American entirely. Okay. I couldn't remember if they were in Africa or not with like aardvarks. I presume that's the other group that I'm thinking of that I can't think of off the top of my head. Yeah, so here's your extant ones. Here's your extant animals that are similar size to some of these sloths, and then here's kind of the energy that the sloths would have given up. So, or given up would have had, essentially how often they would have been moving around. Big Rhamphorhynchus had Xenarthrans. Yeah, that's really interesting that the results were coinciding with the big ground sloths are still like Xenarthran body types, because when you start getting bigger, you kind of expect it to be warmer just because there's more mass. So that's really cool. It is kind of a sneak peek into the process as I'm going, okay, well, here's this part. Let me make sure I'm understanding this, and then kind of bouncing around as I'm doing this. I'm doing it in the middle of the oh, that's some really nice art too. Okay. Gosh, I have hair stuck. More active than extant sloths, but lower. Yeah, that's really fascinating. That is really fascinating. I really wish they hadn't gone extinct, because it'd be so interesting to study that kind of energy expenditure and see how they were competing with various other megafauna. Yeah. Figure 6 is microclimate. Okay. So in their northernmost range, where it's going to be colder, versus southernmost range. Okay. And you can kind of see their coat depth. Okay. Huh. That's actually really cool. You're doing that and correlating that. Low tasm wave. Yeah. I mean, that's my thing too. That was kind of my thinking, is like, how are they competing if they're competing, right? Like, if you don't need to do as much browsing. Yeah, interesting things to think about with this. That is really cool. I'm sorry that I missed this one. I kind of came into this knowing that I was going to miss some of these, just because of the inherent time limit of trying to cover so many topics. But yeah, it's very cool to see that. I was hoping if people wanted stuff to get in there, that they could discuss that. That people who had publications would be able to contribute if they had something they wanted to talk about. So I appreciate it. Michael Deek. Yeah. Double checking names. I'm awful with names. My family called me by the wrong name for years because I couldn't remember their names. So this is looking at Pterosaurus, right? You know, oh, it's this massive giant whale. Mark Whiten's blog from 2019 greatly influenced your thesis. It is a that is a very fun blog, I will say. I do agree with that. Anyway, for this one, they are greatly reducing the size of a Pterosaurus down to about 35 to 40 tons, which is still a very big animal, but it's not quite, 180 tons. They looked at more dense-bodied mammals. So actually, you can get up here. You can see some of the Saurinians, things like manatees, dugongs, and such. This one has the tusks, so I think that's a dugong. I think. The incisors up in the front. Not necessarily tusks, incisors. And then you can see the relative body sizes. And then Pterosaurus is going to be here in their estimates, as opposed to, the size of a blue whale. Again, just making it smaller based on what we know, comparisons to other animals and such. And, here's your potential shape if it was at various size estimates and energy estimates and such. And you can see, like, here's where the original was. Here's where the actual bones probably fit according to this paper. And yeah, it is a smaller animal than previously thought. Definitely not 340 tons. Correct. Okay, now we're going to Mexico for this next one. Coahuila. We're going to be looking at Mexidrocon longimanus, which it's an ornithomimid. It had long hands. That's kind of what you're getting here. Hopefully we can get to some of these figures. Here you can see kind of its where it's at in northern Mexico. There's a lot of stuff out here in northern Mexico that could be found to be new species, and there should be more prospecting out there. Unfortunately, due to the political situation there, especially with the cartels, this entire desert area is not exactly the most searchable right now, which is really unfortunate. It would be very cool to get out there and see some of this stuff. The raptor is indeed chattering. Yeah, I'm good at chattering. You can see some of the metatarsals, meaning essentially the hand bones here. I thought they had art for this thing. And you can see it's grouping with a number of these other ornithomimids, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the phylogeny here. Like, that's just something that happens sometimes. You get your tree made, and it's like, yep, there's definitely a group there. However, we don't know any of the interrelationships within this group. So that's unfortunate. I'm gonna go. I thought they had art for it. That's AI. That's not what I want. I thought I saw someone that had drawn it. Drawn it very, very well. The English language and its and my inability to remember some words sometimes. Okay. Colin! I know him. He's one of the co-authors on that paper. Um, so he was looking at a new Haplocanthosaurus specimen. And what they find is actually Haplocanthosaurus, this relatively small sauropod. Relatively, it's still a very large animal, but it's not, quite Diplodocus sized, as you can see. Would have had a really, really widespread distribution. So yeah, you can see there's new specimens coming out of Montana, Colorado, parts of Utah, Wyoming. There could be some stuff down here, but unfortunately, this is just really hard to access because it's such a remote area. So finding good Morrison Formation outcrops out here is just difficult. Yeah, Brian was on this. Yeah, I do know Brian as well with fossil crates. But as I said earlier, it's like, Colin, my friend. My notes are, Colin, my boy. So yeah, it just basically, Haplocanthosaurus had this really, really wide distribution. So you're not necessarily... There's been some arguments that the Morrison is, because it covers such a wide area from down here all the way up to basically the border with Canada, that maybe there's some really big faunal differences between the south and the north. And you can expect that, and it does seem like some of that is what's occurring. Haplocanthosaurus is interesting because it's the smaller sauropod that is seemingly not partitioned by north to south by latitude. So ornithomimids, what's the idea on the hypothesis that ornithomimids like Gallimimus had more aquatic diets? I really wish they had teeth so that we could do some stable isotopes. That is my opinion on that. That is my first major opinion on it, is I wish there was just more material that we could get better stable isotopes with. Maybe you could do it with eggs. I don't know if they have that many eggs from ornithomimids specifically, though. Yeah, hard to say. Also, a question in the chat: is it just me, or are the southern states of the late Cretaceous generally poorly studied compared to the late Cretaceous northern states? Excuse me. A big part of that is just how partial the fossils are and what is there. So a large part of the late Cretaceous, most of the southern states were either high elevation, meaning they were eroding out. So Arizona, for example, right? Arizona would have had the Arizona Plano. The entire southern portion of Arizona would have been this high mesa with rivers going off of it towards New Mexico with the Menifee Formation and such. But for whatever reason, the Menifee Formation and Kirtland Formation, some of those, are just not very good at fossilization or having more complete fossils. There's good stuff there, but it's just finding like a whole articulated thing the way you can in Hell Creek, for example, is just seems much more rare. And maybe it's just the history of it not being as searched, but it's just one of those things that's hard to say. And then once you get starting going to the southeast, so much of it was marine that you're not getting the same fauna. You're not getting the same dinosaurian faunas. And I do know there are people that are actually doing stuff like that. I know there's actually just I don't actually know if I added that turtle paper. Ooh, I'm sorry, Heather. One of the people I did field work with actually just published on a turtle, a new species of sea turtle from Texas. So there's stuff that's happening. It's just a matter of getting it all together. So Pelecanimimus had teeth. Yeah, maybe you could use that one and do some stable isotopes then. That'd be an interesting thought. Okay, Cretaceous or Antarctic bird skull. So this is Vagavis, which I have a whole video on, but we're out of date now because people are finding more stuff about it. So here's the concretions that have the skull of it. You can see kind of where they're prepping out the bone and whatnot. What they're doing is looking at, I said figure 3. Here you go. Here's where we can compare it to other animals or other birds, especially water birds, because from what we know, Vagavis was at least a Gyoenceran, if not an Enceriformine, or closely related, meaning it was probably fairly closely related to various ducks and such. And so you can see the skull here. This is, the CT scan, so they can make it nice and pretty. This is Conflicto Antarcticus, I believe it is, which is also another inseriformine, but also from Antarctica during the Cretaceous. So these two are probably fairly closely related, or at least lived at the same time. However, as we're looking at some of these other fossils, you can see kind of where some of the articulation of the jaw happens, and it's more similar to that of Gavia, which is actually the loon. So it this is a merganser. Those are fake teeth, not real teeth. Essentially, just the bill would have been serrated. But regardless, you're getting something that is probably very similar to a loon, which are mostly foot-propelled divers, so they'll land on the water and then dive down and use their feet to go. And that's already been suggested for Vagavis anyway, so it seems like that's pretty consistent. Yeah, Javelina formations, paleo elevation was 840 to 1,000 meters above sea level, for instance. Yeah. Yeah, there's another good part for why some of that can be hard to find, because you're just at high elevation, so things just break apart. Things need to get into the basin from somewhere, and they're coming from up high, which means they're going to get broken apart as they come down. It's just one of those tragic things. There's a few isolated places where we have really nice high elevation basins where we can find fossils. The Javelina formation is among the better of those. It's just it's an unfortunate reality of the fossils and paleotopography of North America. This is actually really interesting, because I've actually told about this person doing all kinds of osteohistology, where you're slicing the bone and counting the lines of arrested growth and such, with a lot of the Morrison taxa. So they also have some Allosaurus stuff coming down the line, but Ceratosaurus is the one that's of interest here, and also based on what they found, it grew like remarkably fast. Like it was half of its adult size in 2 years or something is what I'm recalling. So yeah, you can see again, these kind of various lines and structures in the bone for how the bone was growing. The dots there you go. And then there should be a growth curve somewhere. That's the part I want to get to. I know. There we go. So yeah, here you go. Here it is, where it's just this massively rapid growth. Whereas even in things like, some of these Abelisaurs, which are related, much slower growth. With Michael's comment in mind, Alamosaurus was lucky to be one of the most well-sampled Titanosaurs. Yeah, Titanosaurs are... It's really hard to get a nice Titanosaur because you have to bury the entire thing. And that's really hard to do when the entire thing is so massive. So yeah, the bits and pieces we do have of some of those Titanosaurs are really nice. And Alamosaurus having a bit more fossilization is really nice as well. A bit more of the fossil preserved, rather. Anyway, yeah, but again, you can just see this like rapid growth when it's compared to some of these other theropods. Just insanely fast. So, and maybe that's part of the niche partitioning stuff that I was talking about earlier when they were doing the finite element analysis, is maybe it's just growth, and Ceratosaurus was able to do well in the parts of the Morrison formation where it was just a much more stressed environment because of this rapid growth. It could just, try and outgrow it and then immediately be able to, repopulate, kind of like a disaster taxa during drought almost. On a shorter scale than a mass extinction. All right, and we have paratidal British shale fauna. So paratidal means you have your zone where there's the actual tide that's coming in and out. Just behind that, you have stuff that's affected by the waves and the tide, but isn't actually getting exposed to the air. That's basically what this is. And so this is just like a kind of a whole new separate fauna for that. But from what I recall, there's a few kinds of, burrowing worms and such. It's a lot of kind of what you expect, frankly. Where, you get some of these ichnofossils of burrows dug by various worms and such that are going through the sediment, the shale, the mud. Various also microfossils that are Interesting. So these are probably from preapulid worms. This is going to be some of the feeding material. Feeding apparatus, rather. Material. Apparatus. And again, you're not getting like the most pretty fossils. It's Burgess shale fauna as far as having a lot of these preapulid worms, a number of other worms that are going through here, things that can be assessed to, things named from the Burgess shale, but just not necessarily as nice, but it's just showing kind of where this would have been. So here's your Burgess shale. Here's your various other ones. This is the Utah one that's pretty famous. Yeah, and you're able to see kind of the various faunas that are all around, and you get some pretty consistent things in some of these. Could Styracosaurus use its frill horns like an oryx? You would need to do some math and mechanics to see how far down it could tilt its head. That is, I don't think anything that has been specifically answered yet. This is also talking about some of these mosasaurs from Morocco, but this is going, look, there's so much diversity here, which is, like, commented on earlier. There's questions about that because some of these, including Stelodons, is questioned, because this one is specifically just a tooth taxon. It's just named from the tooth. There's apparently a little bit of associated bone, but the bone does not have, it's a dentary, I believe it is, and it doesn't have any of the teeth in the jaw. So it's like, okay, that could also just be another jaw from a different mosasaur. So yeah, that's the issue we're running into there. Yeah. And I think that's going to be, yeah, there you go. So yeah, and then you have your various diversity of the teeth there. And again, some of these could very well be that. Some of these could be juveniles of others, and some of them could be totally different things that I know people are working on discussing. So again, not hopping into go reveal what someone published beforehand. So this is looking at the Mayan Dude Ranch dinosaur tracks where it was the swimming sauropod, which, do they have that? There we go. This is what I wanted. It's like, look, we only have the front feet, which meant it was kind of swimming and just walking along with its front feet. Going back to the site, there's an issue with that in that there are back feet as well, so it was just walking along. Yeah, so here's part of the back foot. The back feet aren't as preserved, which is part of the reason for the misidentification earlier. To Milo in the chat, no, it's not more tooth taxa. It was just doing a summary of the taxa from Morocco, some of which are tooth taxa. So it's not naming any new ones, that previous Mosasaur paper. Anyway, yeah, so it's like, yeah, these aren't, this is not a swimming dinosaur. So, although I have heard some very convincing evidence of a swimming dinosaur, it seems like a lot of that stuff is not going through the same way. Once again, this is a Spanish one. Just real quick, you're in the same area that Mexodraco was found in, and there's ankylosaurs there as well. PDF. You get some of these osteoderms and various vertebrae and stuff. Most of these are not super complete, but you get your kind of polycanthines, no, notosaurs and an ankylosaurid, which would have had the club tail. There we go. And then various other ankylosaurians, where it's like, yeah, it's an osteoderm, it's from an ankylosaurian. We really don't know much more than that. So yeah, there's definitely stuff out there. It's just a matter of getting to it. So, so this is a site in Australia where there is a Carcharodontosaur, a Megaraptorid, and an Ulughbegsaurus. All found in the same area. This is in the Strzelecki group in Australia. And parts of the Yuanmouraptor formation as well are pretty related to it. However, the fossils are all really poor. They're not named anything, but it's enough to say, hey, it belongs to this group vaguely. Spinosaurus actually. Spinosaurus discussion in the chat. They had art for this somewhere too, I thought. Let's see. I'm gonna jump down a little faster. Was it one of these? I can't remember if it was in one of the supplementaries. Otherwise, I will Google the title here in a moment and hopefully find it. It would be the last photo if they had it. Nope. Okay. Then give me one moment. I'm just gonna back up. So I can talk about these animals in a little more detail. That looks like the right art. Yeah. There we go. So there's going to be your Megaraptorid. You know, big arms, relatively small head. Carcharodontosaur, bigger head, relatively small arms. And then your Ulughbegsaurus, which is this raptor-type dinosaur that likely fed on fish. They had fairly conical teeth for the most part. At least a lot of the later ones did. Whether or not these ones did, we don't know because people have not done enough collecting in this part of Australia. Which again, large parts of Australia are very rural. It makes sense that you're going to have difficulty finding fossil sites. Because if your fossil site is 50 miles away from the nearest road, nobody's getting out there to find those fossils. Just the tragedy of fossils not being where you need them to be. This is looking at the glyptodonts. Oh, these are other xenarthrans. But these are big, essentially armored armadillos, and I believe technically they are armadillos now. They're not just closely related. If Michael Deek is still in the chat, I'm sure he might have an idea about the taxonomy there better than I do. But this is looking at a few of them, and they found pathologies in the skeletons of them, the exoskeleton. Essentially, they have this big armored shell as such, and they found damage on some of these, which they attribute to the tail spikes of other ones. So yeah, they were using these tail clubs to fight. This has already been suggested as the main reason for this kind of feature evolving. That was Victoria Arbor who suggested, based on a number of lines of evidence, that yeah, this shows up, these tail clubs show up because they're fighting with one another. And that also goes along with, you know, ankylosaurs doing the same thing. Late Jurassic to early Cretaceous Appalachia. Why have you forsaken us? There is at least, I think, one site in Arkansas in the Trinity group that has some early Cretaceous stuff. I mean, it's all stuff that's basically been named, I think. Actually, there might be like one new lizard there. But yeah, there's some stuff out there. It's just a matter of finding it. I just want to emphasize that as much as I can. These are two new compsognathids. You have Sinosauropteryx linguanensis as opposed to Sinosauropteryx prima, which is the better known one. Prima is the one that was the first dinosaur found with all these feathers. And you also have Wadhurst sinensis. So, you know, that's nice. They do suggest that these are juvenile individuals, but are not juveniles of other theropods that are found in the group that are large ones. For example, Tyrannosaurus, Ute-Tyrannus, the Tyrannosauroid Ute-Tyrannus, which is interesting because it seems like the Tyrannosauroids and the compsognathids both split off really early in the Coelurosaurian trees, and compsognathids are really interesting because they seem to retain a lot of juvenile characteristics. which means, yeah, maybe they are just juveniles. That's Andrea Cow's hypothesis. I think Andrea Cow still needs to do a little bit more to prove why his traits are all the best when you're making your phylogenetic trees. But, sure, it works as a hypothesis. But again, right now they're not really suggesting that that's the case with these ones. And you can see there is some variation here as far as Huandosaurus having the differently shaped skull than Sinosauropteryx. So, and then you can also see this is kind of going back to the paper that I was on. This is why I was really interested if climate had a thing to do with it, where this is a very high elevation cold basin where these animals come from, and you have a Ute tyrannus being the primary theropod, the largest theropod predator, whereas the tyrannosaurs elsewhere are still fairly small, like in the Wessex and in the Shishania formation. So it's like, okay, well, why is this one different? Just cause, seemingly. And maybe, again, it is climate just not letting these other theropods up there, the allosauroids. And that's why Ute tyrannus become the largest theropod in the environment. But that doesn't mean climate caused it to get big. It just happened to be in a climate where the others couldn't exist, and their exclusion led to its success. Potentially. Oh, this was an interesting one as well. So this is looking at the impact of different museum exhibits in engaging with students, and it's mostly tables and whatnot. Boys are the main contributors to interest in extinct animals. However, that is not a long-lasting effect. And also, society. I think plenty of girls and women would be interested in paleontology if society was more equitable in that kind of thing. But that's also just because I think they're wildly interesting. Anyway, they also show that having more visits does help to just generate more interest. The more regularly people are able to get to museums is what's going to influence their interest. But also, having the fossil bones or casts of the bones on display is better than having animatronics, which I thought was really interesting because so many of these museums would go, oh, we need an animatronic X, Y, or Z. Yeah, you can have that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better. It's just different. So I did think that was a very interesting part of it. And someone mentioned this paper in the chat already, but this is from my friend Henry. Shout out, Henry. This is Infernodraken hasticolus. This is the Hell Creek edgedarchid. It is just one vertebra. The thing is, vertebra for edgedarchids can be really, really identifying. Simply just because of the various ways that they need to be able to handle having such a long neck. There's different musculature that can evolve fairly quickly in these different groups of them. So yeah, I mean it's not as big as Quetzalcoatlus, but still a big animal, right? You wouldn't want to just like walk up to it friendly like. But yeah, it's just one neck vertebra, and you can see they have really long neck vertebra, and then these ends are really where you can get a lot of your diagnostic characteristics. It also suggests that North America had a pretty diverse record. It's just that they're also very rare. It's unfortunate. And we're jumping way back to the Cambrian. So Pygmaclypetus, Duonychus. It's this weird radiodont. So, think something like Anomalocaris. Okay, that's a table. Only this one had oh, no, I'm thinking of a different paper. I apologize. This is actually closer to the trilobites. There's another thing that has weird eyes that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and I was getting those mixed up. But this one's interesting because it has different eye designs, essentially, and some of the eyes are stalked. Some of them are just directly on the head. So it's doing a lot of just strange stuff with its eyes, and it shows a lot of variation in essentially the ancestral body plan of arthropods in how their eyes were built. So yeah, you can see there's the various globular facets and such, but different shedding mechanisms across the eyes. So yeah, it's this really strange animal that seemingly is going to answer some of these questions about how eyes evolved in arthropods. And then we have Big Bird. I mean, kind of. So this is probably from Gastornis, which is this really large bird that evolved during the Eocene, so about 10 to 15-ish million years after the mass extinction that killed off the non-bird dinosaurs. But these are just tracks from Washington State, and as you can see, it looks a lot like a dinosaur track, which yes, that technically is. However, they're not, you know, big pointy claws, so it's theropod, but it's because it's a bird, but it's not, you know, predatory theropod. Here's the kind of simplified example of essentially where the depositional environment would have been like. Various plants and whatnot that were around, and they have somewhere in here, I believe. There you go. There's the footprints of a closely related animal, Diatryma, from Wyoming, where you have, you know, again, this is up above the ground, so you're not getting that, you know, back toe or anything. You're just getting your 3 big toes, and then your nice little figure of the art of it. So yeah, and here's where some of the Gastornises are found in Europe. Here's where they are in North America, and then you have kind of this thought of migration route through Greenland into North America, and then they were actually able to get into Asia through the Bering Land Bridge. So there we go with Gastornids. And now we're on Carcharias/Ototus megalodon. It was big. They basically just looked at the verts and were able to figure out the shape of it was probably a lot more like a lemon shark, Negaprion here, where it's a lot more low slung as opposed to a great white or a lamna. I think it's either the porbeagle or it's the salmon shark. Lamna. I think it's the porbeagle. It might actually be both in the genus, but obviously much more squat body, slightly longer, and it seems like this would have been the most efficient body plan for megalodon. This kind of low slung, long body. Anyway, so they give it a minimum of about 11 meters for megalodon, which would be about 36 feet. Potentially, loosely, as much as 30 meters in the oldest individuals, but realistically, probably closer to about 24, which is going to be about 80 feet or so, which is still a very large animal. Of course, there's still uncertainty throughout this, right? Because we don't have a lot of great fossils with all of the vertebra in megalodon. And so, you know, there's variation there. We could be smaller or bigger. And I'm sure people are going to argue about this because megalodon is a very charismatic fossil organism. And there's a lot of people who want to research it and want to prove, oh no, it was this big. Oh no, it was actually smaller. Oh no, it was whatever. What have you. So now jumping into Bihatosaurus, which I don't think I have all this one. This was just looking at the teeth of Bihatosaurus, which Bihatosaurus is here initially, where it has these large spines that were coming up and out of the neck. But they micro-CT scanned it, looked at the various teeth, and it seems like it would have been a low-feeding specialist, which is, again, what we kind of expect from some of these Dracaeosaurs, is what this group is called. And so, yeah, it's doing what we expect. It seems like a lot of these sauropods were or would have been feeding on different plants just so they could coexist in the environment with other sauropods. Although this Bihatosaurus does not come from the same place as the Morrison, does not come from the Morrison Formation, where there's just massive, massive numbers of sauropods living alongside one another. And jump in here. PDF. Do I actually have access to PDF? Yeah. Download that. Open with Firefox. Here we go. So these are fossil feathers, but they're an entirely new preservation of feathers. Because normally there are these little like carbonaceous films that are pressed into the rock in certain places. This is from Italy, and actually relatively recent in Italy, the late Pleistocene. You can see these feathers from a griffin vulture. Griffin vulture? One of the vultures. Whichever one full this is. Regardless. These are preserved uniquely because they're in zeolite, which is a mineral. So the feather structures themselves were actually replaced by the mineral. And what seemingly happened is this vulture was dead, either from a volcano or from the volcano that it was buried in the flows of, or otherwise. And when the ash landed on it, it was also accompanied by silicon and aluminum rich fluids that were able to start producing the mineral zeolite, which allowed it to be preserved. You can kind of see the representation of that there with the already dead vulture, and then one of these like really, really nice examples of a zeolite preserved feather. And it's like, okay, there might be more feathers out there. If we have the right conditions, we can find absolutely incredible soft tissue preservation. We're still finding new kinds of ways for geology to preserve feathers and other soft tissues, which is really cool. If you think of feathers as really funny scales, it's on topic to jump to here. So this is just looking at the scale growth in dinosaurs and in modern reptiles, and it's basically allometric, meaning essentially the scales start at one size, and as the animal gets bigger, the scales keep getting bigger with the animal. But also there's some really interesting examples in here of scale types that aren't seen in modern animals. If I can find the right one. Again, you have some of these where there's variation in the scales in some of these dinosaurs, but there's one figure where there's one that's like, oh wow, that's really different. There you go. Where these very irregular scales, which I think is just wild. So yeah, I mean, but basically they're growing the way you kind of expect them to. They start small. As the animal gets bigger, the scale gets bigger. So it's not like they're adding more scales as they get larger. Okay. So yeah, that's gonna be that one. And then we have Duonychus, which is the two-fingered Theropod. Here's your graphical abstract. You can see having just two fingers showed up a few times. There's the birds where they kind of have three, but two of them are fused together, so it makes it into one. The Alvarezsaurs went all the way down to just one finger. Therizinosaurs at some point developed just two fingers. There's oviraptorans that have been found with that. Tyrannosaurs have been found with that, and even some of the allosaurs have been found to just go down to two fingers. So really interesting that happens so often. The other thing, was it this one or one of the other ones? Yeah, here we go. It's nice also because you have the keratin sheath around the claw, so you can really see kind of the size of the claw. So you got to think that there's the bony part, which is what we normally get preserved, but then you have, here's the bony part, but then you have the keratin still around it too, so you can really see how much more recurved it would have been with the bone dotted here. Let me see if I can zoom in on that. There you go, with the little white dot here being the bony core of it. And then, this much larger keratin sheath. Yeah, this one was on the news. It's a neat little thing. I mean, I say little, it's a big animal. But it's a neat organism. And then we're going to a Metriacanthid, which is another one of these kind of like Allosaurus-like groups, metriacanthids. This is Yuanmouraptor jinshajiensis. There we go. And so type locality, it's from right over here. It's close to a number of these other sauropod sites. So you do have some things that it was maybe predating upon, at least juveniles. I like that they have like, here's where we found it in, and it's like, wow, finding nice fossils under grass is hard. Plants like to get in the way of fossils, finding fossils. You can see there's a decent skull. You know, it doesn't look the most pretty, but it's enough you can put together most of it and go, yeah, this is a metriacanthid, very nicely. Also, this is where I was talking about Piatnitskysaurus earlier, because sometimes Piatnitskysaurus is found in a group called Carnosauria, which is the allosaurs, the Piatnitskysaurs, the megalosaurs, and maybe one other group. Metriacanthids are in there somewhere, yeah. This paper, if I can find the phylogeny, they do a great job of describing every single bone. I do appreciate that. There we go. Finds Piatnitskysaurs as the outgroup to Avatheropoda, and actually the megalosaurs up here earlier as well. So essentially you have your tetanurans, which are basically your more derived theropods. You get megalosaurs branching off and spinosaurs branching off very early in there. Piatnitskysaurs also branching off earlier, and then you get this big split between allosaurs and the Coelurosaurs, and Metriacanthosaurs are found within the allosauroids. So, yeah, it's definitely interesting that Piatnitskysaurs. The tree's been bouncing around so much in the last few years. It's interesting to think about kind of where that might go as we find more and more material. Once again, anagenesis, this time in Triceratops, based on the record in Canada. Again, you're kind of to say that you have found anagenesis is Snacks on, yeah, Snacks was on the phylogeny on the previous paper, yeah. It was still found next to Allosaurus, so it's all just still Allosaurus. Howdy in the chat. I see someone saying hi. Is that ASM? Anyway, so yeah, like it must exist inevitably. They haven't done a ton of stuff with the Colorado stuff, but they are suggesting that, hey, maybe we do have an anagenetic series of Triceratops in Canada with some of these, and E being loosely called Triceratops albertensis, where it's in air quotes. Yeah, I mean, the issue with saying anagenesis is the point at which you get to cladogenesis instead, right? It's like, well, how do you know that our Triceratops fossils that we have, that population evolved directly into the next one? Are we sure that another population somewhere didn't evolve into the other Triceratops species and then move in and displace the older ones? And you can do that really well with things that are like mollusks in the Western Interior Seaway. Like the gastropods, the snails specifically. You can go, well, there's this much rotation on this snail shell. Suddenly there's a change in one population, one local environment, and then you see it take over the rest of them. You can go, okay, so that's anagenetic from this population of this species to the rest of the population. As for trying to show it in Triceratops, it's a lot harder, and you kind of just have to be like, yeah, we think so, and we don't know, but also we think we found it. And so it's just one of those things where there's just some fundamental issues that just exist in paleontology with the fossil record, right? Like you can't just you can't say we know this for sure ever. Almost, you have to go, this is what our hypothesis is. And anagenesis is one of those things that is always going to be a hypothesis just because there are so many unknowns. So yeah, that's the issue that exists with trying to prove anagenesis in the vertebrate record. So this is another fossil from Uzbekistan, and it's from the Besetki Formation, which there's a number of various animals, various dinosaurs from there. What's interesting is this is just a finger, but it's very ankylosed, meaning essentially, yeah, it's really, really bony, and maybe it was a digging theropod, maybe. It's interesting. Yeah. The fossil record is probably too limited to prove anagenesis, at least in the vertebrate record. Sorry, there's a delay between my stream and the chat, so if I'm bouncing back and forth, it's just because of that. Anyway, yeah, so that's what you're getting. You're getting there. Is it could maybe it's like really weird. This bone is a really weird early Therizinosaur or something, or it could be an Oviraptoran because they were doing weird things, or it could be an Ornithomimus. There's so many things it could be, but it's just a very weird bone. Maybe it's also pathologic. Maybe it just had too much bone growth for whatever reason. Yeah, the Besetki is really interesting. For a wild crocodile, which is fun just because it's like, hey, why did crocodiles do so well? Because they did a lot of things. And it's really easy to go, oh, what do you mean? They're all the same. Today, mostly, yeah, they are, but there's a lot of variation in their historical record. This is basically just using various geometric and linear measurements combined with what they're related to try and figure out dietary ecologies, and then final inferred ecologies. Essentially just what was the animal doing in its environment, right? That's the main thing that they are trying to find for these crocodilians. If I jump to... And here you can see, these are all crocodilians. They're in a lot of different ecospaces, with some being closer to lizards, Lepidosauria being lizards and Tuataras, as far as their ecospace they're in, some of them being close to the mammals as far as their ecospace they're in, and then sure, yeah, a lot of them hanging around what modern crocodilians do. But it's still just really interesting to be like, yeah, no, they were doing a ton of things in the fossil record. But that also means that they are pretty flexible in what they eat, and that's probably what led to a lot of their success, is that flexibility. Figure 8, there we go. But you can see that too, right? It's like, oh look, here's how diverse and how much different ecospace they were filling, and then they start to go down a bunch, and then they drop massively up until the modern day, where they basically don't have a lot of variation in what they're doing. The one thing I will mention is there's this one I saw where it's a Cuban crocodile, and they actually still have slightly recurved teeth, as opposed to just conical teeth. And Cuban crocs are known to be, of the modern crocodilians, the most terrestrial. So it's, yeah, they still have these more, curved teeth as opposed to just conical teeth, which I think is wildly interesting. Yeah, but it seems like their really flexible diet of crocodilians is what's really led to their success. They're not specialized on anything. They'll just kind of grab it and go, whatever it may be. This is also another croc. This is a land croc, the Sebasids. This one is not super complete, but it's from Hispaniola, which is an island in the Caribbean that contains the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And so it's like, oh, okay, it was the top predator in there during the Miocene. And again, it's not named. It's not a whole. It's not complete enough to name. But you can see kind of how, yeah, these Sebasids were still on land down here and eventually started to get up into the Caribbean. And some of them stayed there. And then eventually they died out there too, and other crocs moved in, including, for example, the Cuban croc, which is in the Caribbean. Although I believe it is limited to only Cuba, though. I think the American crocodile is the one that gets on the various other islands. So, yeah, but really neat to see that there was a land croc that was the dominant predator in some of these Caribbean islands just a few million years ago. And there's your artwork for it as well. Once it clears up, there we go. All right, there it is, looking over the wonderful, wonderful vistas of Hispaniola. There's another one here, which is actually not in the Besetki formation. It's in the formation just below. And it's basically just another maxilla and goes, hey, well, Ulughbegsaurus is in the Besetki formation. We have another maxilla that's partial, even more partial than the one that named Ulughbegsaurus from. But it's probably Ulughbegsaurus. It just may not be the same species of Ulughbegsaurus. And again, that's in the formation just below the Besetki. So the Kodzakul formation. And so yeah, it's just like neat. There's more diversity, more fossils that are coming from Uzbekistan. This kind of Central Asian province has started to become really promising, and there was a lot of deposition there for millions of years. It wasn't really until India started to kind of uplift parts of that region that it stopped being a depositional basin. Basically, stuff was always just being deposited there up until recently. The dinosaur 5 times bigger than T-Rex. Yeah, they really did not understand that it was larger than the Tyrannosaur in its environment, not that it was bigger than T-Rex. Oh yeah, I know you know that's BS. I'm just also going to comment on it because I want to make sure. Yeah, that they did not understand Tyrannosaurid or Tyrannosauroid versus Tyrannosaurus, whoever made that article. So this is looking at phylogeny of Crocodiliformes, or Crocodilia. Regardless, crocs and their relatives. And so they actually find is crown group crocodilians don't show up until later. So like modern crocodiles. However, you have things that are obviously very close, including Dinosuchus, which they find way back here, which is interesting because a lot of people have said Dinosuchus is actually really close to the alligatorines. And if it's back here, it is not very close to them at all. But again, this is a really big crocodilian, which likely was able to disperse across multiple continents. Both sides of North America, at least. Rather. There's one figure that shows that, I know. There we go. Where you have this kind of interchange between the two species. It's probably happening. There is stuff that is being looked at in here that I don't know if Dinosuchus has come out of it in Texas, but there is research being done on some of these. Anyway, yeah, so I love that they use salt and pepper shakers for osmoregulation, because that's basically, can they control the amount of salt in their bodies so that they can swim across oceans? And in the gharials and whatnot, yes. And the crocodiloids, yes. Meaning that the things more like Nile crocodilians, Nile crocodile, saltwater crocodiles and such. Alligators, though, no. And seemingly in Dinosuchus, probably. And there's a few different papers that have suggested this recently. So that would make sense, as the Western Interior Seaway was cutting across North America, and we have these two continents that are separate but both have Dinosuchus present. Yeah. So that's what's going on there with Dinosuchus. I think this one is just that little note, right? This one where, yeah. So this is looking at a bunch of the really small ornithopods from the Morrison Formation, and it's basically going, hey, yeah, we don't have enough material to actually say any of these can be named confidently. Yeah, here you go. We regard all of these taxa as Nominaduia. Basically, yeah, we gave them names back in the day in the 1800s, but none of them is complete enough to say anything about it, to actually like matter. So they did also find that one of these, though, which was formerly, because I again call it an invalid name, Drinker was potentially an early pachycephalosaur, which is interesting. Um, Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The thing is, the pachycephalosaurs are frustrating because they kind of just show up, and by the time they show up, it's like that's a pachycephalosaur with nothing else. Um, so yeah, the thing is, they're still just all very partial. And then again, they're still using drinker in air quotes, so they're not treating it as valid. They're treating it as maybe valid if we find more of it, and also it might be a pachycephalosaur, which would be really interesting. But yeah, they're all small and fragmentary, so it's hard to say for sure. And then we have the hell ants. The hell ants are interesting because instead of biting, camera's over here, side to side like this, they essentially had a mechanism which allowed their head to be up here and they could crush things into it. Really weird animals. However, this is one from Brazil, and it's actually really early. It's the earliest known ant in the fossil record, coming from about 114 million years ago. And then by 100 million years ago, the hell ants had made it into Myanmar. So they diversified very rapidly and spread around the world very rapidly, based on the fossil record at least. And so yeah, here you go. You can see like this little mechanism up front for it biting. Yeah, it's not a great CT scan. There we go. Yeah, but it's a hull ant. It's really interesting that it was doing this. You can see again, kind of towards the front of that, where they were biting, and then you have your phylogeny of them. This is where this current hell ant comes from. Then we get a whole bunch in the Myanmar amber, which I have whole video on discussing some of the ethics around that. But the taxon named after Cope might be relevant to Pachycephalosaur evolution. Marsh is rolling in his grave. Sorry, I'm just appreciating the comment. Anyway, yeah, so that's essentially what you're getting, and then these eventually all go extinct, but kind of be expected because ants do weird things. Then you get to your modern crown ants. And again, it's from Brazil, which is interesting because it's just from such a different time period. This is Rabidontomorph ornithopods. So these are things that are at least closely related to the iguanodontians. They're looking at them. Ulughbegsaurus is a new genus of one from France, and you can see, here's our timeline of, oh look, we have some of the first Rabidodon. Oh hey, look, we have Iguanodon. Oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of things floating around, and eventually it's okay. Well, we're starting to actually figure out more of this taxonomy, and there's a lot that's changing with some of this, and we're starting to realize this is actually a really, really diverse group that unfortunately is not very complete in most cases. But yeah, it's interesting to see what's there, and as we jump down, we can get to the tree where Dryomorpha is basically the other large like hadrosaurs and such. And then up here you start getting some of these Rabidontidae type animals. And obviously Ulughbegsaurus not being very complete does group in different spots in different analyses. Just part of the tragedy of very partial fossils. This one is actually fairly short, but it's a Mark Whitten one, who is a fantastic paleo artist. But it's basically just hey, what if we just talk about like the history of megalosaurs, where he talks about Megalosaurus being presented as one of the first dinosaurs described. And so this is closer to his reconstruction, right? Where It's going to be on Facebook. This is kind of his work where he was like, okay, so this would be the musculature of it. It maybe had this little crest. It was slightly elongate snout. Well, then you also have the Crystal Palace Megalosaurus, where it's obviously very, very different. And so just kind of using Megalosaurus as the example of how paleo art has changed over time. New frontiers in dinosaur exploration. This is basically just going, hey, we've been finding dinosaurs for 200 years now. There's still some places where we have not found a lot. So like Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India, Madagascar, because they were kind of their own province for a good part of the Mesozoic. They split off of Africa and were kind of just floating out here in the Indian Ocean for a good amount of time. And again, we saw some of this very similar graph earlier, but basically going, yeah, we should probably be looking more in the southern continents, especially Africa, because that could help explain a lot of things. We need more fossils from the Carnian, which is kind of when dinosaurs start to just suddenly appear everywhere. And we also need stuff from the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, because there's a big faunal change there where you still have some of these really big land crocs, the Rawasuchids, and then they suddenly die out, and then suddenly dinosaurs are everywhere again after that, or become more dominant in their environments, rather. Middle Jurassic also. Middle Jurassic just sucks for having good fossils, just because there's not a lot of terrestrial land-based rocks from that time period. So basically just going, yeah, this is what we know over 200 years. This is what we need to work with in the future. I already saw someone go, Cow's paper on the Bahariya Formation was a little bit insane. And yeah, there's definitely some assumptions in it. For example, some of these bones are missing parts of them. And so he's going, oh, well, it's just normal variation within the hip bone here. And we don't know that. Like, that's the issue. We don't have enough specimens of these other animals to say, yeah, it's just variation. So yeah, he kills off some of the names that were used historically, like Deltadromeus. But Andrea Cow has some very interesting ideas. He also needs to ground test a lot of his data, because he is getting results that are interesting, but are different enough from everyone else to start thinking, well, maybe it's your methods that are the issue. But also, he could be right? Like, it's hard to know for sure, because again, a lot of these fossils are partial. A lot of these fossils were blown up during World War II. So, it's you know, grain of salt, but yeah, like I said, I think it's interesting, but I just want to see it tested more thoroughly. Oh, but I hear the baby going. My wife should be grabbing the baby here in a moment. When dinosaurs here like barn owls. So this was essentially a response to a paper which looked at the ears of the Alvarsaur shuvia, which, there you go, there's the art from that paper essentially, where they go, yeah, it probably heard about as well as a barn owl, which is very, yeah, this video will be up later. The barn owl has slightly offset ears that are a very particular shape so that it can hear really, really well. And it's, look, these are the same shape as barn owl ears. But this is a bigger animal, and they were pointing out that the relative size of the ears in Shuvia is not comparable really to the size of the ears in the barn owl relative to their own body sizes. So it's like, yeah, listen, maybe it did have good hearing, but it's really hard to say that based on the data that's available right now. And you can see like the outliers here, right? Where the red is Shuvia, the blue is Tyto, which is the barn owl. And there's nothing in the length of the skull and the length of the ear duct or anything that really suggests that it was hearing nearly as well as a barn owl. Okay, getting closer and closer to the end, which is good because my voice is starting to go. So yeah, this is actually looking at a new Herrerasaurin from the Malari Formation. Herrerasaurs are this group of maybe early theropods, maybe early sauropod relatives that are still predatory. There's a lot of questions about their phylogeny, in part because many of them are very partial. However, very importantly, hips, very good for identifying early dinosaurs. It's like this is more than a skull or anything. If you want one part to identify a dinosaur from the Triassic, hips. So yeah, it's a new Herrerasaur, been named Yuanmouraptor cudii. You know, like I said, it's interesting that we're getting these from other parts of the world, because they're mostly in South America. There's a few in North America in the Chile Formation, and I believe this is the first one from India. But yeah, you can see where it's plotting. You know, outside of Herrerasauridae, this group over here is going to be all of your North American taxa. So you just kind of have one random lineage that seemingly made it to India, and we don't have a lot of information on it. But it is interesting. It is interesting. Hopefully a few more of those will be found and we can start doing a little better phylogenetics on it. Yes, this is looking at your calcium and strontium isotopes within teeth, and it's assessing diet versus diagenesis. So diet, whenever you eat something, that food becomes your body. So if there's certain isotopes of calcium or strontium that are in what you're eating, they become part of yourself. And this is using enamel on dinosaur teeth just because enamel is very wear resistant. Diagenesis is essentially all of the changes that happen to rock as it becomes, you know, as it goes from soil to rock. So as it gets buried and compressed and chemical changes happen, that's all diagenesis. There's definitely some questions. So they found that Tyrannosaurid enamel had low rare earth elements and uranium versus the dentine, which is again what you expect, whereas the ceratopsids overall have higher levels of both, which is kind of what is what this is suggesting should be the case, because it's already going to be rare. You're just not going to have that as you are eating less and less plants that are directly interacting with the soil. However, there may also be some diagenic stuff happening because there's no negative strontium ratios in anything they've done, which suggests that the strontium was enriched during diagenesis. So it may also vary, and diagenesis, strontium varies a lot, even just by individual basins for what isotopes are there. So it could just be some other unseen effect that is causing the signal that they're seeing. And there you go. You can see the kind of slight differences in the concentrations of your strontium, or calcium rather, on that one. Okay. Okay, this is a new well, I say new, it's not named because it's not very complete, but the silosaurids are maybe dinosaurs. They're at least closely related. They may be the first ornithischians. It's from the Dockham group. It's interesting to find one in the Dockham group, but again, it's kind of expected because there are some in the Chinle Formation, and the Dockham group and the Chinle Formation are not the same formation, but they are very similar in terms of what you're finding in both of them. So the fact that we have one in the Chinle Formation, we would expect to find one in the Dockham group as well. I don't recall if they did a phylogeny in here. Yeah, they do. Yeah, Periodontata. Yeah, so this is going to be going towards the rest of the ornithischians. And so they're saying that, yeah, they are directly related to the ornithischians. Which, again, there's debate about that because the hips on silosaurs are funny. And that's an issue when you're looking at dinosaurs because, again, like I said, hips are really good for identifying these groups. It has hips that are not perfectly dinosaurine, but maybe on the way to being more dinosaurine. In which case, is it a dinosaur? Do we need to move the origin of dinosaurs back? There's all kinds of questions that new fossils could help answer. So Shishania is something that was described as a mollusk initially, and kind of as the ham, the hypothetical ancestral mollusk I discussed earlier, where it's, yeah, cool, it's got this like single shell, there's the bottom of it, it's going to, just kind of slime along. They're suggesting that this is a Chancellaurid, which are basically a sponge-ish type animal, with these very like characteristic like star-shaped mineralization patterns. When they got in close on one of these figures, I thought, right, just the one figure, okay. When they got in on some of these, they were able to start suggesting some of these patterns are much more indicative. And this is people who do invertebrate paleo who know exactly what they're looking at and for, and I do not. We're able to say that a lot of these structures are more like those of the Chancellourids, so much more similar to those of these sponge-like animals. And this is something that was only named last year, Shishania, so I imagine there will be some debate maybe, but not positive. Another kind of review paper of just, hey, how do we measure dinosaurs? How do we do various methods of it? Review papers are great because that way you can cite just the one thing. But especially as we're trying to get to the masses of different dinosaurs, having a good resource for understanding all of the various methods, what kind of error and whatnot is happening, is good. And you can see how different methods can produce different masses. And then this is going to be essentially how late Triassic dinosaurs move around. High res. Oh, I clicked the right one. Heck yeah. Using your phylogenetic tree and whatnot, and essentially calculating where the dinosaurs came from and how they migrated to different areas. So I'm saying this paper is the gold standard for body size estimates. The previous one, yeah, no, like it's a review paper that is great because it provides just a single source for how you should be going about doing sizes and different kinds of error you can get from different methods and such. So yeah, it does very well. Basically, they would have started in South America, and then various things like theropods likely migrated up into North America and then over to Europe, but not so much into Africa. And that makes sense. Some of the largest and the latest, really large of those predatory crocs that are Rawasukids that we do find, Rawasukians rather, are in South Africa. And then, your various sauropods and such also moved through these various dispersal routes, including from South America into Southern Africa. So, yeah, this is just a whole paper just about dispersal during the Triassic. So, blue and green lines indicate Herrerasaurs and Sauropodomorphs respectively. So all the blue is like, okay, well, here's the Herrerasaurs moving around, and your green is the Sauropodomorphs. And then, of course, eventually they did go everywhere because we've found dinosaurs on every continent. And now I remember someone mentioning this about Troodon. They're saying Troodon is valid. They have proposed a new neotype for it. And a lot of these late Cretaceous formations are pretty well unified. They're just called different things depending on where you are, just because the geological surveys were different, right? So this is technically all one formation, but the Alberta one named it something different. The US one named this part of it something different, and then this part of it something different. So you have Judith River, the Two Medicine, and the Oldman Formation and Dinosaur Park formations. But yeah, they're saying Troodon is valid. Troodon is a tooth taxa. It was named from a tooth. And we found other stuff since then that might be better, including another animal called Stenonychosaurus, which was a tooth taxa plus a little bit of the jawbone. So they're also saying that that's not perfectly reasonable to use. And so they have actually a good growth series because there are some embryonic troodontid material from the formation. And what they're saying is, hey, look, if we use this, we can have a whole new diagnosis, give Troodon to this entirely new specimen. So everything that's might be Troodon is now compared to this new specimen instead of just that tooth. It's what it is. I will fully state that I think Stenonychosaurus is a better name. I like it more. So, but it's what it is. Troodon would have priority anyway, so fair enough. Anyway, yeah, so here we go. Here's where it's plotting out as far as the phylogenetics. So it's related to some of these Ornitholoides and Goevenator that are Mongolian. And then starts getting over here into some of these more separate populations. Yeah, keeping Troodon prevents the nomenclatural issues. That is the correct response. I was not as worried about it being Troodon or not. Was my whole thing. It's like, sure. Anyway, but they have like a real diagnosis here that's not just a tooth, so fair play to them. So the allosaurs have been suggested to have been insectivores, but that's only like the really, really derived ones. So Deinonychus is one of the early ones, and they actually did chemical analysis of the stomach tissues, using things like Raman spectrum analysis. Yeah, Troodon is famous, correct. But what they found is basically what they were getting from the spectrum analysis is that it would have eaten some sort of animal and it would have had bones and such in its stomach content. So, yeah. And Deinonychus is getting towards, the one singular big claw, but not quite there yet. So, this makes sense that they weren't necessarily immediately jumping into being these insectivores, as has been hypothesized. Yeah, I mean, basically that. This is the thing with the weird eyes, the other one with the weird eyes. So this has had 3 eyes. This is Monsura fantoni, and it would have been a radiodont, but a really small one, or a relatively small one. Just a few centimeters long, right? The scale bars are 5 millimeters, just for context here, right? So let me zoom in. So this scale bar is 5 millimeters. So this whole thing is maybe 2 centimeters across. Here's another one that's a little bigger, and it's still, 5 centimeters long? So these are not super big radiodonts. What is interesting, though, is in some of them, there we go, you have this really intensified tagmosis, which is when arthropods are essentially adding body segments. So it's something that shows up in these radiodonts that aren't arthropods but are closely related. And so, yeah, this is really similar to what we do see in a lot of other arthropod groups, like the horseshoe crabs, hexapods, which is like insects and their relatives. It also probably had a lot of these segments for respiration, because there would have been essentially a set of gills on each one of these segments. And so, yeah, this kind of tagmosis just evolved multiple times in many of these groups. And was that the one with the art on it? No. There's one of them. There you go, with the art on it. You can see it has these 3 weird eyes, and it has these still very pointy raptorial appendages, meaning that it was still probably predatory in some degree. There's a great paper about the alleged dinosaur decline is likely a fossil record bias and Cretaceous structure in North America. Is that Alessandro Chiarenza's paper, I presume? From Milo in the chat. All right, next. All right, so the Field Museum in Chicago got an Archaeopteryx fossil. Yeah, Chiarenza. Chiarenza is great with all the modeling and stuff that he does. Anyway, Archaeopteryx at the Field Museum, and this one's nice because it's actually preserved a little bit with the skull upside down, meaning you can actually see the bottom of the skull. And they did CT scan it as well. But what that means is you can look at the palate better. And so the palate is similar to that in the Troodontids, but also starting to develop some of the kind of shape that we would see in the crown birds and modern birds, right? And obviously it gets very changed as you get further forward in some of these birds. But it's essentially showing that, yeah, no, the skull condition was basically adopted from a troodontid relative or the common ancestor between the birds and the troodontids, and then modified towards what we see in birds. So it really helps to suggest that that's kind of what we are looking at. Additionally, figure 4, I really like this one, especially this part where you have, again, the keratin sheath, and you can see it under the X-ray diffraction photos, where here's the bone, and then you have that keratin sheath over the top of it. More of the cranial pieces, that's all extended figures, but yeah, they're looking at it. It also had some skin on the hands still, which suggests that it was still using the hand potentially to grab at prey as opposed to just using its head the way modern birds do. Birds don't really use their wings to grab prey, right? So yeah, it's really interesting that this one specimen, because of its unique position, can show us a little bit more about Archaeopteryx and kind of how it would have been. Okay, we are getting there. Amniote tracks. These are the oldest amniote tracks, and they're from the very early Carboniferous, which is interesting because this is basically the early Carboniferous was still all like, the Temnospondyls, those more amphibian-like tetrapods. And then in the late Carboniferous is when it was thought like, the amniotes started to evolve, things with hard shells that could, leave the water for prolonged periods of time. The claw marks on these tracks from Australia really do suggest that the potential for amniotes to have evolved much earlier than thought. And that means that the amphibian lineage and the amniote group would have had to have diverged in the Devonian. And like, for context, this is basically right around when we're finding Tiktaalik, which means, sure, Tiktaalik is this great thing for understanding this, but they were already well onto land by the time of Tiktaalik, amniotes and tetrapods. So just crazy to see that potentially around the time of Tiktaalik, the first amniotes and amphibians and whatnot were really starting to start evolving. Okay, and then this one's a PDF, so give me a minute. With Firefox. And this is the Abelisaurs before Abelisaurus. So there's a lot of really partial material found in Europe of various theropods. And this paper is basically going, well, how much of this is actually just this other group that we now know of? The Abelisaurs. And a lot of it actually is. Some of these are like, Megalosaurus brendi, because everything was just given the name Megalosaurus back in the day. And it's like, nope, that's an Abelisaur teeth, actually. That's very much an Abelisaur teeth. Oh yeah, this femur from Maastrichtian beds. That's an Abelisaur. And so there's a number of other pieces of fossils that are like, oh yeah, no, this is an Abelisaur. This is an Abelisaur. So a lot of the stuff that was found in Europe, that's still very partial, is found to have been from Abelisaurs. And really, they needed good Abelisaurs to know what they were looking at. Because sure, you have a couple of limb bones, one dentary, so one lower jaw bone, and a handful of teeth, but that doesn't tell you anything else about the rest of the animal. So once they started finding Abelisaurus, Carnotaurus, Scorpiovenator, which are all from South America, then we could start putting together, oh, hey, this group is actually the Abelisaurs. So all the stuff we're finding in Europe is actually still Abelisaurs. Yeah, yeah, the Marapunisaurus is similar. This isn't necessarily renaming things, because this is still all so partial that you can't really name any of it. Um, there's already so much diversity in the Morrison Formation. I would not be shocked if there is a Robocosaur there. I do think you would want to find a new specimen of it, though, before you start naming it for the Morrison sauropods. But yeah, it's basically going, yeah, we found a bunch of this stuff. We didn't know what it was. And then the new finds in South America really helped to tell people what it was. And I am missing one that I wanted to talk about. Just give me one moment. I need to find the correct crocodilian turtle paper. If I can type names properly. Okay, there's that, and it should have been a paper that just came out. So, there's that. There we go. Slide that over. So this is a new marine turtle, sea turtle, from Texas, and so this is the Archosaur site that they're working, that I mentioned a few times earlier, where it's in this deposit in eastern Texas. This turtle is really interesting because it has this ridge along the back, which you can see is very pronounced in the front profile. So it's super, super, super interesting. But also when you're looking at some of these, there's bones on bones, which is something you do find in a lot of these sea turtles. Which this one has been named Asmodochelys leviathan, after, the leviathan. But it's one of these really, really late Cretaceous sea turtles, and most of these died out. However, there's the potential that this one might actually be closely related enough to, it might actually be very closely related to the group that did survive that extinction and made it out into modern day sea turtles. Because, for example, Lepidopterus kempii is the Kemp sea turtle, I believe. One of those ones. So some of these are modern sea turtles. And so it's just starting to give us some of those informational bits into kind of how these sea turtles started to diversify during the late Cretaceous, and then later, after the extinction, some of them were able to make it through and become modern day turtles. So, yeah. That said, there we go. I am caught up as much as I can be. I know there's still probably a ton of stuff that I really wish I could have talked about that I didn't. But I needed to get caught up. So now I am caught up. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending. I appreciate it. I will wait for a minute to see people's comments, well wishes and whatnot come in, and make sure people are still good with what's happened with the stream and whatnot. Yeah, I mean, it was really just trying to get caught up. So now I'm going to try and get to maybe even streaming more regularly, every other week or so, and doing this just so I can try and keep up on it better. Yeah. Otherwise, is my chat just not updating there? Yeah, this is great. Long time missed. Yeah, it's just trying to keep up with actual research. There will be another live stream for June, yes. I may try and do more than one, and I said that, but you guys are lagged a little bit behind where I'm at, so that's probably why you're not catching that, or the text is a little bit behind what I said. So yeah, there will be another one, hopefully in a few weeks here. I have one more thing of field work to do, and so we'll be getting that done, and then otherwise we should be good. I will be able to hopefully now sit down and make more of these shorter videos like I used to be doing more. Yeah, doing your own research makes it very difficult. Gosh, my hair is wild. I apologize. No, and I enjoy streaming. My voice is just a little bit shot now. I need to remember to like bring water up and then also to drink it, because every time I've come up here to stream, I have had water and then I forget to drink it the entire time. So, yeah, glad people enjoyed the stream. We'll be doing this again, and be safe, take care, and as always,